Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Rebecca Keller.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
Hey, I am great, and I'm so excited to talk with you.
Me too. I was researching you earlier today, and I was so excited. I'm like, oh my gosh, I get to have the coolest person on this show. Can you tell me a little bit about your book and yourself?
Well, about myself, I am a visual artist. I've spent my career as a visual artist. I'm a professor at the School of the Art Institute, so I'm a sculptor and a painter. I do all kinds of artwork, and I joke with my students that I didn't get enough rejection and work for no money as an artist, so I decided to take up novel writing. And you know yes, I'm not sure why. I'm a masochist, I guess. So but so I started writing, maybe writing seriously about uh writing fiction about, I don't know, 12 years ago, something like that. And had sort of a series of stops and starts, but finally, just last April, my debut novel, You Should Have Known, was published by Crooked Lane Books, and it features a 72-year-old woman named Frannie Greene, who had just moved into an assisted living facility. She has her own apartment. She's sharp in mind, but a little bit, she's had a fall, and her kids convince her that this is the best, safest move for her. And so she reluctantly moves in, and while she's there, she meets a new friend, a woman named Katherine. And this new friend, and it's quite different than her, but she's challenged and intrigued. However, she later discovers that Katherine's husband is the corrupt judge who she blames for the death of her beloved granddaughter and the real falling apart of her daughter. And things proceed from there.
That is such an interesting plot. It sounds so cool. We were talking about it right before we started recording, but this story does have an older woman as a protagonist. What inspired that choice for you?
Well, I wanted to write a story about a good person who might be, who succumbs to their worst impulses, sort of a morally complicated character. And I think most of us can imagine, very few people have such a strong moral compass that they couldn't, given the right set of circumstances, talk themselves into doing something, even in the name of justice, right? Justify doing something pretty bad. And so I started thinking about what are the conditions that might let somebody, the guardrails that normally keep one's behavior on the straight and narrow. And one of them is being old enough to be thinking, like, what are they going to do to me?
Yeah.
Because older people have a certain kind of invisibility in this culture, especially women.
Mm-hmm.
And she begins to think strategically, look, I can maybe make that work for me and get away with something that otherwise, at 20 years before, the stakes would have been too high. And of course, after having lived long enough and seen what had happened to her family, she feels justified. She can temporarily justify to herself, something that I don't want to give away too much, but at least attempt to do something.
That is so interesting because it's like that. If you have almost what looks like immunity, what will you do? How far would you go?
Right. And of course, she discovers that she's still her. And even though her life circumstances may change, the same sort of guilt and the same sort of compassion and the same sort of sense of right or wrong that she's always had. And she's a retired nurse, so she's really, she's her medical knowledge figures into the plot, but it also figures into her character. She has empathy, and that catches up with her. She thinks she can act, but she can't. So that's, there's a psychological element of having to reckon with her own, guilt.
It's fascinating. So you mentioned that you made the switch from like fully visual art into novels. What inspired that? Aside from, as you're saying, being a masochist, but
Well, it's not like I've left art making behind. I don't,
mm,
I really don't exactly know. About, like I said, about 12 years ago, I'd always done a lot of writing, put it this way, to begin with. I'd always done a lot of writing for my art practice, the kind of writing you have to do for grants and things like that. In addition, I'd written a lot for museums. I'd written a lot about art in a kind of creative way, not necessarily a dry academic way. And then about 12 years ago, this idea for a novel just sort of grabbed me by the throat. It was not this novel,
oh,
but I decided, I'm going to give it a try. So I wrote it. I finished it. It will never see the light of day.
would you mind sharing
But
the plot with us then?
it was I don't really it's too it was about actually it was set on a college campus,
Mhm.
which obviously is an environment I know well. And it had to do with sort of, it was kind of a campus satire in a way.
Mhm.
Um, and so and part satire, part kind of romance, kind of a rom-com thing between kind of snooty, visiting professor from Yale and a insecure creative writing, resident who uh and their trials and tribulations. Like I said, it will never see the light of day. There are some parts of it I'm sure I wouldn't cringe at, but I know there are parts of it that I would.
You know what? We all have those stories, though. It's
Right,
great to
right.
hear from published authors that they also have books like that.
Well, of course. I mean, you have to learn, right? You have to learn somewhere. And I'd never had a formal writing class in fiction. I didn't know, and so you learn. That's how you learn, by going through the process. And but I finished it. I saw it all the way through, which is, as one person at the time I knew said, many don't ever get that far.
Yeah.
So I took that to heart. But at any rate, so I wrote that. So then I was, because I'm stubborn and a masochist, I was committed to writing fiction. But I was also exhibiting my artwork. I was raising a family. I'm teaching. Um, and I had an opportunity. Actually, I was commissioned to write a book about my artwork, um, and some other projects I had done. So in between that, I was doing that, but I was also decided it might make sense to try to write some short fiction, because a novel just is so time consuming, and I had these other projects going on. So I wrote some short fiction and won a few awards. And then I came to a moment where I thought, okay, I'm going to, dive back in. I had this story that started as a short story that wasn't a particularly good short story, because it didn't want to be a short story. It wanted to be a novel. And that's what ended up, through many, many, many iterations, became this book.
That's so cool. See, I love that. I love that you say like it didn't want to be a short story. Do you find that your stories kind of go their own direction
Right.
sometimes?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. Because, and that's part of the writing. Part of writing is someone said the first draft is to tell yourself the story, to learn the story yourself, and to get to meet people, to get to meet these characters. I think one of the questions you sort of, suggested that we might discuss um, was when do you remember, do you have a favorite part about writing the book?
Hmm. Yeah.
And one of the things that, there were certain scenes I really enjoyed writing. And it was often because I kind of knew, I was at point A, I knew I had to get to point B, but I really didn't have any idea how that would happen. Uh, And I had often, I would start with maybe an image, just the character sitting in a car, the character at a place. Often, if I could find a place that would be reasonable for them to have these thoughts or to run into the person they need to run into or whatever, then things would just sort of flow. And I would find, an hour later, 2 hours later, however long, oh, I had no idea that would happen. And suddenly, things take a life of their own. So, those moments are really exciting and engaging. You just feel completely sort of focused on what you're doing, and it's really it's one of those things like any creative person where you have those moments of flow where you just, when you're done, you think 2 hours have passed and it felt like 5 minutes, and you feel really like alive.
Oh, absolutely. Those are some of my favorite moments too, when the story kind of goes its own direction or takes its own path. Do you ever
Has its
feel
own
that
life.
way about your visual artwork, or is it completely different?
Yeah. Sometimes, I mean, it feels the same way in terms of the kind of um, focus. When you're in it and you're doing it, and the rest of the world just falls away, and you're there. And then, however long, often time goes really quickly. You look up and you're shocked to find that you've been working for hours,
Mhm.
because it doesn't feel that way. And then you step away, and so yes, sometimes just when you're in the process, it's not exactly analogous, but that the internal feeling of connecting with in a kind of extreme sort of concentration, um, with what you're the project. Yes, I do. And I think a lot about um, the relationship between my art making and my writing, and
Mhm.
how they overlap, how they differ. Um,
Would you mind
and
sharing some of that? I was going to
yeah,
ask you actually about what that relationship does look like.
yeah, and I mean, uh, well, one thing it's funny. I realized that when I look through my sketchbooks, when I go to my studio and I look through my sketchbooks, quite often there's not really many sketches, or the sketches are extremely rudimentary and like scritchy and arrows, and but there's a lot of written description of my thoughts, and a lot of, and sometimes quotations, snippets of poems, ideas in written form, not necessarily in a sketch form, a drawing form.
Mhm.
And then when I go to write, a lot of times in the scenes I've just described, um, I'll have an image, and that's really all I have. And I'll go to my computer and open up my document, and I'll just sort of start with the image. And maybe those are, I mean, maybe in some ways they're the same thing, that in both cases I'm using words to describe an image. Um, but in my sketchbooks, I'm using words to describe an image I want to make, or an object I want to make. Whereas in the computer, I'm using an image to direct my language. That makes sense.
I think that that's beautiful. And totally like a perfect example of creativity, how it all feeds into it itself and it's reflected out in so many different ways and it's not rigid, right?
No, no. I mean, one thing I can say is making uh, novels is a little easier physically than shifting 50 pounds of clay or whatever.
Hmm.
It's, but it's no easier. No, I mean, nothing, no creative process is easy. I have come to believe, but they can all be, exciting, uh, and thrilling, and you learn from them. You learn as you
Oh,
go, and even if what you learn is that the project you're working on is no good, you have to start with something else.
But that's an exciting moment too. It may not feel like it while you're working
Right.
on it, but after you can look back and go, "Oh, that taught me something." And now I'm
Right.
wearing
Because
it
no
today.
work is wasted. No work is wasted. And,
Mhm.
a paragraph from it might show up in something else, or an image, or an object might show up in some other project. So yeah, nothing is wasted. And of course, the experience of learning from it and working
Mhm.
on it.
Now, kind of shifting gears, talk a little bit more about the idea phase for this. What made you want to write a mystery? Was it that initial idea about the character or something else?
It was kind of because I wanted to, um, I mean, so I wanted to write a story about someone who's kind of morally challenged, right? And a dilemma, some sort of moral dilemma. And it seems like, obviously, it is not the same kind of mystery where there's a body on page 3 and the detective shows up on page 5. It's not that kind of mystery. It sort of straddles. It's maybe a psychological, um, mystery. There's some literary aspects to it. So, but I really, it seemed like a mystery where somebody dies and nobody exactly is sure if it was a natural death or not, and the person, the protagonist, Frannie, is pretty sure that she did something that she is has to redeem herself about.
Mhm.
um, I wanted that kind of dilemma, and the stakes to be really high, so it seemed to me like a mystery was the place to examine things about justice and grief and self-justification and all of that. So I didn't want to make I wanted the protagonist to be the person who is, not she in this case is both kind of the criminal and kind of the sleuth. I don't want to say too much, but she works both ends of the street, sort of.
Interesting. Mhm.
And which gives her, she's in this sort of complicated spot.
Okay. Well, thank you
And
for sharing. Yeah, I was just curious where that came about. Were you like when you were younger, did you ever write, or was that something that came later when you really decided to write your first book?
I did write. Not Did I write? I don't. Maybe I wrote a little bit of fiction on occasion. I wouldn't have even called it fiction. Maybe I wrote some stories or was interested in in essays
Mhm.
or sort of creative writing of all sorts. But I didn't pursue it with any seriousness, except for the writing I was doing about art, which was quite, you know, uh, meaningful to me, and it still is. I still write about art, and in fact, I may be, I've been asked to put together a proposal for an art publisher for another book. Um, I may or may not. I haven't.
Congratulations.
Well,
That's very
we'll
exciting.
see. I mean, a lot of it is how, like every masochistic person like you or I who are writing and trying to earn a living and doing all kinds of other things. You have to kind of figure out where your time is best
Mhm.
deployed. So,
I started with acting and then moved to writing, so I understand the masochism for sure.
right? No, no doubt, no doubt. So, yeah, exactly. So you get it. So,
Mhm.
um, but I may, I also have another, novel in that I've just finished a kind of a complete, uh, 1.5 draft of. Um, so, you know, uh, I have to I have to figure out exactly how I'm going to deploy my time. But in terms of starting fiction, I didn't really begin it seriously until, like I said, about 12 years ago. Uh,
Mhm.
so,
I'd
and to
love to
tell you
talk.
the truth, I didn't think I'd ever be able to maintain the plot of a mystery. I
Oh,
always felt like, oh, at sentence level writing, I'm great. At a plot, I'm not great at. And then I got to know a fellow writer who said, "Are you crazy? Your plots are great." So, because I was batting around some ideas, and so you live and learn, right?
That is so cool. Yeah, it's that's something that happens a lot, though, I feel like with writing and all sorts of creativity, where you think, oh, this is my weakest area. And so
Yeah,
you're working the hardest on it, and then it ends up being a strength.
right, right, exactly. I'm
Mhm.
sure in the performing arts that's very true too.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I'd love to hear some more about your nonfiction writing, if you'd want to share a little bit more about your art writing, how that came to be.
Sure. I mean, I've worked for a lot of museums, so a lot of it is museum writing. But I've also I have another book called Excavating History, which for
Mhm.
a long time I did. Um, it's kind of the umbrella title for a series of projects I did, both solo exhibitions, writing, public programming, and collaborative projects. And I did them in public historic sites. So if you think about a historic house museum, for example, a lot of times people go and, you know, they talk about the doorknobs or something, or about the famous person who lived there. But, if you visit once, often you don't need to go again because
Mhm.
they never change the story. And there's always parts of the story that are left out, to make a either a coherent narrative, or it's not quite supported, or it's problematic. There's historical aspects that are problematic. But those might be the most interesting bits. And so, excavating history, I did a lot of projects all over the world, actually, about in historic sites, sort of making exhibitions, making work that for that place. It was very site specific, that kind of complicated the narratives,
Mhm.
or told stories that an artist could tell, that the curator maybe felt were suggested but not absolutely provable, but you could kind of use an
Interesting.
imagination with, and told all kinds of stories about these places that otherwise were not being told. So I, me and a wonderful small press that doesn't really exist anymore. It kind of does. It named Stepsister Press. Put out, it's a beautiful book. The Illinois Arts Council supported it, and it has contributions from the former someone who used to work at Hull House, from collaborators, and from the former director of the Chicago History Museum. A
Oh,
couple long essays from me. So it's a fascinating. It's kind of a strange hybrid, book, but it's still, a lot of people still write me about it, actually.
that sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool book. So that's the kind of writing that I did in between, and I wrote that after I had decided I was going to also write a novel. So I
Mhm.
was sort of in between. My attention had to be kind of necessarily fragmented, which might be so why so long it took me so long to get You Should Have Known out into the world.
Mhm. But that
But that,
also sounds like it would help bridge the gap between writing nonfiction and fiction and kind of finding where you land there.
yeah, I'm partly. I think so. It certainly taught me a lot about editing and and just like really holding my feet to the fire about you know what I wanted to say it. Economy, and being willing to, as a fellow writer, kill your darlings.
Hmm. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. So I have a question about your art. So that, like, this is fully about visual art, but I'm just curious how, if any, literary devices play into it. Because you were talking about how you didn't feel very confident with plot, but there's plot and there's character and there's so many different things that can come across in a sculpture and anything. How does that show up for you?
In my visual work.
Hmm.
That's interesting. It's an interesting analogy. I mean, obviously it's analogous. It's not the same. Although when I look back, I was just looking through some old slides of, because I'm old enough. My career started when we had slides, and they were. of the series of artworks I did that paired these kind of fragmented images with text, actually, and the
Mhm.
texts were not my writing, were quotations from people. So obviously, even way back then, this is a long time ago, I was very susceptible to the power of the written word, and I wanted it somehow to be in my visual art.
Mhm.
Um, but the things like metaphor and analogy and simile, they exist in visual work as well, and I'm very interested in them. And I talk a lot. The biggest crossover actually has been probably with teaching,
Oh,
because, and in a way that has surprised me, in that I, I'm relatively new to the practice of writing. And over the last 10 years, I've just kind of taught myself and learned from, reading and talking to other writers and listening to podcasts and things. And so I could watch myself learn. And so when I would go to talk to my students, my sculpture students, who were in the midst of learning something, I, in some ways, it's been a long time since I was in art school, but and as an artist, you're always learning things. It's not like
mhm.
it's not like the work I make is the work I learned to make in art school. It's extremely different. But the process of learning a creative practice, as a newcomer, and of feeling that out of one's depth, and that, both excited and uh, inexperienced, is, made I think it made me a better teacher, because it made me remember in a really vivid way what it's like to be in that position.
That is so cool. Thank you for sharing that. And you know what? Thank you so much for coming on today. This has really been a fantastic conversation. I've loved talking with you.
Well, that's my pleasure, but I feel like I didn't get to plug the book, so you should have known. Go buy it.
Oh
Is
yes,
that
well, my next question was, what do you have coming up? And this is your chance. Freely plug all of the things.
Well, with the holidays come, I'm going to be traveling a lot. I will be doing a presentation at the Oak Park Public Library in April. I have a few things I think out east, but off the top of my head, I don't know their dates. But I do know that I have a Substack called Under Construction with Rebecca Keller. And the book is available. It's doing well. It's been beautifully reviewed. Uh, and I hope people are interested in reading it. And if they want, they can go to my website. It's distributed by Penguin Random House, so it's widely available. And I'd, love to hear people. I'll share one anecdote that somebody said to me, which was really meaningful. um, I was at a talk and somebody came up to me and she said, I read your book the same week that I was moving my mother into an assisted living
Mhm.
facility. And she said, I would normally have been very short with her because she drives me a little bit crazy. She said, but after reading your book, I had so much more empathy for her. And I felt so much more connected to her because of your book. And that
That's beautiful.
just made me feel so good, because I mean, obviously I want to sell book, I want people to read it, but you really, as a human, you want, I didn't, I want this to be an experience of one human being creating something that another human being finds meaningful. And so I was so grateful that she came up and told me that. So um, I'll leave it there instead of
Wow.
a sales.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's the best thing we can ask for with our art and writing is that it'll like create more empathy and do things like that. That's a gorgeous story. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share it with you.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Rebecca Keller.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after.
The
The
end.
end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.